Kia ora, and welcome to an in-depth conversation we are having this week with Mr. Balamohan Shingade and Ms. Taarati Taiaroa at the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation at Massey University. This week is particularly exciting because we have friends who are artists who have really been thinking about the ways in which art can serve as a transformative space, not only in terms of articulating entry points for social change, but also I think what I've been learning in conversing with you is thinking of art itself as a space that can be imagined in new ways through creating of spaces for voices. So I am very proud to share with you that we have this week not just one voice but two voices in dialogue. So truly in the spirit of conversation with our artists. This conversation also for me I think is a transformative entry point because although art has often been a part of the culture-centered approach through our documentaries and photo voice exhibits, we really never have thought about how you theorize art and place it at the center of a radical imaginary. That's why I'm so excited that you both are here and to really learn from you in that sense. So Balamohan Shingade is a writer, curator of contemporary art, and as he says, an occasional performer of classical Indian music. I do hope that at some point we get to listen to some of that. He is a master's graduate of Elam School of Fine Arts, where he was formerly a teaching fellow. Shingade is currently the assistant director of St. Paul Saint Gallery at Auckland University of Technology. His research focuses on artistic and curatorial practices and theories of community, belonging, and minor politics with a special interest in South Asia and its diaspora. For me personally, it's really been exciting to engage with you, Balamohan, particularly in terms of thinking about what does South Asian diaspora even mean within the context of its various roots and tributaries of conversations in a fairly complex area. Taarati Taiaroa, Nati Tuware Toa Nati Apa Teatiawa is an independent cultural worker with over 8 years of experience in devising and delivering arts education, exhibitions, public programs, and community workshops. What has been so touching in the conversations with you, Taarati, is your open-mindedness, your invitational spirit, and at the same time, I think in many ways the radical politics that you embody in the union work that you have done and sort of thinking about what it means in terms of art, precarity, and collective representation of artists. Her past research and projects have explored the structures and values of artist-initiated, community-based, and collaborative practice. As you can see here once again, the themes of community and collaboration form key elements in the works of both of these artists. A graduate of the University of Auckland, she holds master's degree in both fine arts and museums and cultural heritage. During this week at CARE, both Balamohan and Taarati will be conversing with us about various ways in which community, art, practice offer anchors to thinking about cultural change. They will be conducting a workshop on art and social change on 28th November, 11 a.m. on the Massey campus. And drawing from local exhibition histories and recent practices, what I'm hoping we will learn from their work is the imaginary possibilities of thinking about community and what community even means. Balamohan and Taarati will discuss how social change can be imagined and how it can open outwards from within the context of contemporary art practice to thinking about structural transformation. The question we have been conversing a lot about is how can art and exhibition making affect and be affected by the world? What can an exhibition do? what does the context of art allow for, and what are the imaginative seeds that can be born through these coming together of communities. So I really look forward to working with you, and I'm hoping that this dialogue will open up some space for that. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting us here. We're already learning so much, and it's been our second day. It's a real pleasure.
And it's so lovely to have you here and sort of continue the conversation from the time that we met in Auckland. So, I want to begin by perhaps asking you a little bit of a personal accounting of your own journey. So what brought you to art?
Big question. Where shall we start? Shall I start?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I suppose I was always going to be an artist. My mother was an artist, and yeah, so that was never questioned. It was a natural progression, and I knew when I was 4 that I was going to go to art school. That was it. There was no other option, and that wasn't something that came down from my parents. It was just the thing that I wanted to do, and so yeah, I suppose I just wanted to make. I enjoy making things, but it wasn't. I suppose what I grew up in terms of making or art making. My mother was a painter printmaker, who also told stories, but when I went to art school, my conception of art changed, of what type of work that I wanted to make and why I wanted to make it. So maybe growing up, it was quite a modernist conception of an artist who makes discrete artworks, and during the process of art school, my politics in terms of what I wanted to make and how I made it changed. Yeah. What about you?
I think most people are surprised, that a migrant Indian boy chose to go to art school, right? So I went through art school. We went to the same School of Fine Arts, and I got into art school based on my painting portfolio. But while I was there, the first year that I was there, I figured, looking around me, that actually there are much better painters here, and began to kind of see that my interest was becoming more and more in the interpretative capacities of me accompanying them and thinking through their practice. So I stopped making work basically in my first couple of years, and to survive at art school, most of my practice then became what looked like social sculpture or organizing events, or what eventually led to a curatorial practice. And a key sort of touchstone for a lot of my peer group and my own practice has been the very first project in the framework of a curatorial practice, but also the very last project in the framework of an art practice. So it's like that random blur. But in the year 2012, Taarati was there, and 40 others, a sort of simple work called 36 Views of Mount Taranaki, which required of everyone to travel to Mount Taranaki on Voyager coach lines, which is a commercial tourist bus, Auckland to Taranaki and back over the duration of a day, trying to think through place, trying to think through like a practice where you inhabit a scene of inquiry together alongside other practitioners. How do you co-create an experience which then gives the reason for an exhibition? So these sorts of seeds were sown at that time, thinking about what a curatorial practice might look like.
Or even just, I suppose, a temporality or a shift in expectation. The thing that I was always railing against at art school was that it was it's taught in a manner in which you're going towards an end goal, which is the discrete artwork predominantly, although you can do other things, discrete artwork and an exhibition outcome. And so I was more interested in the process, and I think your 360 views of Taranaki was about the process more than this outcome. The outcome is an excuse in which to have an engagement. Or a conversation, or come into relationship, many different things. So to shift the emphasis on terms of a sort of focus on production or expectation of what might be an acceptable form at the end.
Yeah, so this is like a theme that we keep returning to in some ways, like a practice that allows us to inhabit sites of learning alongside others. So an exhibition that might allow us to inhabit an inquiry alongside other practitioners, or a accompaniment through conversational research that might allow us to dialogue and inhabit a question together. So, I mean, that's kind of what brings us together again and again, because of this approach which wants to see our practices, whether it's curatorial, writerly, artistic, or otherwise, as ways in which we can accompany people's thinking, we can accompany people's making, and using the kind of infrastructure that allows us to do that. So working within a gallery, or working within an educational institute for a while, or how we actually started out working at artist-run initiatives.
Totally. Yeah, I feel like artist-run initiatives are, like for both of us, they were a structure that was created, or in my case it was a structure that already existed, that we could engage with post-art school to essentially make the community that we wanted to be a part of in terms of how we operated in that space. So Artist Initiative is a space that is run by artists for artists, usually non-commercial. Often it might have a physical space or a kaupapa that allows for the visibility of practice or making work, making things possible that otherwise there isn't the infrastructure within the art sector for that particular type of work or way of working. So in my case, I was part of an artist-run space called Room, which is the longest running artist-run space in New Zealand at the moment. But I was there for 3.5 years, and I was there when it had just turned maybe 17. It's in its 20s now. But it sort of gives you that same support that maybe art school gives you in terms of peers to converse with, but also the ability in which to show or work with other people and their practices that you value, or to put forward a challenge within the system. Balamohan was part of an arts-run space which was new.
There was a couple of friends who I went through art school with who founded a space called Snake Pit. And the reason, my dear friends who, as they were passing through a Paris, Texas shop, bumped into the landlord and said, "Oh, before it's demolished, before it goes, maybe you have 2 weeks or 2 months, but we'll just use it as a studio in a gallery." So Paris, Texas, if you take the X and make it into a K, it becomes Snake Pit. So that signage was turned into Snake Pit, and that became an artist-run space, which we inhabited with a sense of urgency, because every 2 weeks we thought, oh, this is going to be the last project, because it's going to be demolished. And like that, it went for over a year with last show, last project. But in both of these, I guess what's really been a learning experience has been things around observing how artist-run initiatives allow a practice to be possible. So, for example, I think in the case of any of the artist-run spaces, it's usually run by artists for artists, and there's a sort of communicative, a space where exhibition making is possible. But then I guess what you bump up against is asking the question, well, we're in this position because we might be comfortable with the precarity. Like we might be comfortable with the idea that we have to work in retail and then have an art practice on the side and then be part of Snake Pit or Room. Like there's a level of income maybe that you're comfortable with that allows you a certain kind of practice. But what about those who are not comfortable with precarity, who need support in different kinds of ways? So then that's kind of begins this questioning around, well, who is not able to join our collective? Who's not able to be in a position where an exhibition is possible for them?
Or the practicalities of perhaps having an artist initiative, which is a gallery, is not working 2 days a week or 1 day a week because you're manning the gallery, or you have those unpaid administration roles.
Yeah.
In the same way that any sort of grassroots sort of community organising has that. You know.
Yeah. And I guess one more thing to add to that is like that can be sometimes a little bit problematic, because in some ways you can observe how a setting up of an artist initiative space with the language of community, with the language of participation and so on, can sometimes just be in order to have exhibitions so that you can get dealer representation, so that you get like this sort of commercial viability of your practice and get it out there. So it's really interesting to kind of observe how the same languages and logics can sometimes be, feed into structures that reiterate and keep those same systems.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's for real sort of community participation.
Yeah. This is so powerful. And, there are a few things that are occurring to me as I'm listening to you. The one is, it seems that in both your journeys, there have been many inflection points, many points of reflection, reflexivity, and transforming not only your own practice, but your concept of the very meaning of art. Could you speak a little bit to sort of what constituted or what brought about these sort of registers for change?
I mean, I guess one of the things that occurs to me is the discomforts that you experience because of a certain expectation, let's say. So for example, a curatorial practice that, there's of course 100 different ways of having a curatorial practice. But one of the things that I've been reflecting on a lot this year through the exhibition making, but also I can see that it's a constant theme, is that who am I to represent anyone? This sort of call for a curatorial practice to stand in for the artist. Well, actually the best person to stand in is themselves, because they've got the story, they've got the community, they've got the voice, they've got the knowledge of the practice. So
we've talked a lot about not wanting to be an expert in someone else's practice.
Yeah.
So but then also recognizing, the way that the structure is set up is that there are a certain amount of paid positions, and those paid positions are like a support network in which to make practice visible, right? Like the sort of expectation of entertainment of an exhibition or an experience of the arts for an audience. But that it sets up then a dynamic in which it's, because of the precarity of the artist and predominantly unpaid working conditions, means that those that are in the paid sort of structural positions are expected to purely be in service to the individual practice, the representation of the individual, without thinking about the community or the wider audience of that practice. Like it's quite an odd triangle that you're dealing with. Yeah.
And I guess like
and it becomes extractive
Hmm.
and transactive,
Yeah.
and sometimes a sort of default to the usual forms, practice as normal, not really challenging the way things are done or how we might disrupt that inequity. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess in that same way, it's paying closer attention to what makes a practice possible. Whether it be a practice that is studio-based, like let's say sort of a classic imagination of an artistic practice that is studio-based, works with the language of contemporary art painting and so on. That practice is possible within a sort of community of practices that enable it to be possible. And holding that position is very important. Holding the position to be a painter in a studio is as political as working in a community. But what I guess the complexity is how both of those practices are not disassociated from the world, that they're totally embedded in the world. And drawing through, I guess, through curatorial or otherwise practices, how it is that those are worlded. What is the, real meaningfulness of holding that position? Because the artists who might maintain, let's say, a studio-based painting practice, are a really can sometimes show you how a precarity of an artist is happening in the world. How their practice is being made precarious, or and then to come back to that idea of representation, it doesn't necessarily just mean the representation of an artist's practice, like the interpretative representation this painting means, or anything like that, but also the kind of terms on which you might engage with an artist practitioner, and being very careful, maybe trying to see possibilities for distributing power rather than kind of using this authorial narrative around let me show you a grand narrative of a art movement or something.
This is so beautiful, and reminds me at every moment of being in this conversation why I feel like I learn so much when I chat with you, and part of that is this idea of how you think of community as, first of all, that it's not a monolithic entity, that it is continually being produced and materialized, and that we are accountable through our various forms of practices to generating particular kinds of communities that we want to inhabit. So, when you say sort of this art is an embodied space of community, you're also situating in relationship to precarity that artists have to negotiate continuously, right? So I guess, one of my questions is, how does one negotiate precarity as an artist, their own precarity, having to survive in the neoliberal world that we are in the midst of, and push for change by imagining community at the same time in different ways?
That's so difficult.
It's really difficult. Yeah. I mean, on like a practical sense, to like working in education and art education, particularly within the polytech sector, there's this conversation around the product of the qualification, the arts degree, right? And the expectation of there being a defined industry or job at the end. Expectation of how much a graduate will earn in the first year after they graduate. But the nature of an artist is that job is not defined. You make that job for yourself. And if it was defined in a very particular way, then we would be perhaps not pursuing contemporary art, we'd be pursuing something else, maybe more of a technical trade or a skill or something like that. A functional way that art can be applied, to advertising or whatever that might be, which is fine. But that's a different context. So often within my experiences within education is that looseness or that ability to self-generate is not valued in the same way that the very predefined role is, or the predefined job description is. So it takes there's, how am I trying to say it? Maybe there's I feel like we're at maybe at a moment where there's a mismatch between what is being sold sometimes in degrees, that you will do this degree and you'll get this. You do this degree, you'll get a practice, you'll be an exhibiting artist. It's not that linear or simple, and it takes a lot of sort of intrinsic motivation in terms of why you're doing something or what you're pursuing in order to reach a point where you can sustain yourself. And in that precarity as well, there's sort of is it spoken or unspoken, but an understanding that as an artist you often have like a job that is not necessarily your calling or your passion. It might be, but your actual work is your practice. So you're constantly working 2 or 3 jobs as opposed to one sort of career or profession. There are I suppose some artists are able to sustain themselves on their practice, but I suppose for myself that mode of working or operating, of being able to sustain myself as an artist, would require me to make a certain type of work that I don't feel compelled to make. So there's a way of trying to find a secondary means of getting by in order to do the work that you want to do.
Yeah, I mean, working from within the position of a curatorial practice, I guess for the past 6 years or so that I have been within an institution in safe sort of employment and so on, what's been interesting is to observe within the existing frameworks of an exhibition what practices neatly fit hand in glove and what fall outside of that. And that depends on so many different things, like taste making, depends on people's practices falling in the durational capacity of an exhibition format. So for example, a usual exhibition format at a small artist run space or whatever might be 6 weeks or 8 weeks. Some works necessarily fall outside that scope. So I guess a constant learning for me has been, what are the kinds of practices that are, let's say, default mode of exhibitions facilitate, and what as artistic practices fall outside that scope, and can we de-link the usual modes of exhibition making from an artistic practice and find ways to support the artistic practice on its own terms, right? So a practice that might take a artist 2 years for it to work often falls outside the scope of any exhibition at a small to medium space. But there may be other ways, programmatically, like within the gallery's program, that can support that. So those are the kinds of ways, I guess, from within our own positions as working within institutions, we are trying to be more attentive to and trying to change our program that allows for that to happen.
In what I hear from both of you is this idea of the constant need for reimagining and rethinking, given the spaces we are in, either in the boundaries of institutions or within institutions, the ongoing work of reimagining and pushing back almost, right? At the same time, recognizing that these institutions work within highly neoliberal logics that want the outcome and the output and the effects. And, one of the things that I was wondering about you, there seem to be two phenomena. You have the creative class kind of argument, which is sort of built into the neoliberal logic in many ways, often obfuscating the precarity of the everyday labor of cultural workers. And sort of tied to that, you have sort of these cultural measurement, cultural metrics kinds of industries. I mean, there's been this huge movement at UNESCO with cultural metrics, and those make me very uncomfortable because those seem to push for, just like what you're saying, those outcome-based economistic measures that write over and almost erase those other spaces and imaginaries. So one of the things I was wondering is whether at the boundaries or within institutions, what do you think are the tangible ways in which change can be made, especially in the backdrop of this whole movement toward monetization of culture?
Yeah, I mean, it speaks in some way to the way an artist is able to realize their projects given the terms of their engagement with an institution or a gallery. So for example, there's this, let's say, tension between a way of practicing that might say art for the materialization of knowledge, but also there's art as a mode of being in the world. So for example, to give you a recent challenge that we grappled with very interestingly at St. Paul Street Gallery within the exhibition of How to Live Together was an artist who wanted to radically reimagine who the audience might be and say that an experience for the audience is dependent on their relationship with me. Not necessarily that this sort of consumptive model that I might put something up and it's a general sort of experience that people might come to in order to consume something and then leave with. So that's the resistance work that I guess he was locating. And so the artist is James Tapsell Kururangi, and the work is called Living with My Grandmother for 1 year. We're a gallery in Auckland. James is an artist who is a recent graduate of Massey University in Wellington's art school, and the incident is that his grandmother passed away and made it feel necessary for him to move into her home and inhabit the space, because to what I guess he's trying to reconcile is the heritage of a performance art tradition and the heritage of thinking through who his audience might be grounded in kapa pamari. So for example, who am I in relation with my family, with my community, with my place? And that makes for a very specific inflection to a gallery program. So an ordinary gallery program, as I did and I struggled with, to try and say, well, there's nothing that an audience member coming to St. Paul Street can see. Not even a documentation. So for example, James is resisting even, and I think it's a beautiful idea, kind of photographing anything from the home and then sending it to the gallery and saying, look, this is a project. But really kind of saying, who are we doing this for? You know, what is an art practice and how can we resist it playing into the logics of consumption? And I guess that kind of speaks to this ongoing work that I'm hoping to learn more to do, which is listening, like deep listening in such a way that you begin to understand the terms on which an artist would like to work, and seeing what potentials there might be within whatever you have control over, of working alongside or opening up or whatever that might be.
And I think it's also this question, what is the most appropriate form? Like there's kind of, I remember when you were working on that show and there was we had discussions about this sort of tension of the expectation, what the audience is expecting of this resource, the gallery, and the works in it. That's trying to, maybe expect that some people might be really annoyed that they can't see this work, but being able to sit with that being uncomfortable because it's resisting something, and that's interesting. Not giving in to the need to show everything, to show your relationship, to show, to make it valid in some way. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think one more example of that is of like curatorial practice as accompaniment and as listening and as conversational research, which is something that I look to Taarati for, is a sort of casual conversation that sometimes opens up a really meaningful space to work in. So for example, a dear friend and ongoing collaborator, Kiani Matatasipu, who's a photographer, in one of the very casual conversations where it was just having a cup of tea and I was going over to meet her new baby, she was storying her experience and said something to imply my position as an Indigenous Indian person. And that opened a really beautiful conversation because it kind of allowed me to kind of share with Kiani what it might be to be in relation with her as an artist and curator, because to say, no, I don't quite understand, because no, I'm quite not Indigenous to India, but actually, I think there's someone you should meet, because that person who is from, the Tangmi community in Darjeeling, who is really working through indigeneity in the South Asian context, would be able to speak to this in a way that I don't even know about. So what kind of support do we have within the gallery structures to invite that person over, to engage in that dialogue? And then it's this thing of like, for an ordinary audience member, it becomes very difficult to accept, in the sense of like, oh, well, when can I get involved? What can I consume? But the ripple effect of those conversations are immeasurable in some way.
Absolutely.
And that immeasurability is where art is located.
And that this beautiful example of dialogue, because it's like the idea that dialogue is generated through being in relationships, and is recursive, always invitational, contingent, inviting others into that space. And what I find really promising in this conversation is the work of pedagogy, the active teaching you're doing in terms of reworking your audiences. What is an audience? Who is an audience? How does an audience enter into a conversation in a world of metrics, in a world driven by metrics, right? Where we are even, in that sense, trained to look for particular kinds of outcomes in our experiences of everyday negotiations, right? I find that really transformative.
Absolutely.
In that sense, I wonder also what being in the context of Aotearoa, within the context of Maori knowledge and Maori struggles, contributes to how we might imagine other possibilities outside of a strictly metric-based, commoditized framework.
I guess speaking to the metric part of it first, we're in a, I'm so grateful to be in a position in a gallery where the metric of audience measurement is not something that we have to use to show our success. And in fact, this is a space where the director of the gallery, Charlotte Huddleston, keeps open. That's her work as the director of the gallery, is in her beautiful sort of resistance work as a director, to keep open this sort of space where new imaginaries for a practice can be possible. And it's under her kind of generous leadership that this sort of way of thinking seems possible.
It's almost like, you guys have a luxury that other sort of more public-facing galleries don't have the same. They have the metrics, up front and centre.
And it's
every
like
day.
an ongoing work
Yeah.
that Charlotte does to keep that space sort of soft for us to keep treading. And I guess coming back to the question of our relation to place, especially alongside Indigenous peoples, I think this, to my mind, as a personally speaking, is an ongoing inquiry, an ongoing sort of question, because to speak to a personal biography, my family are migrant families, and we moved here in the year 2000. We moved here under the points system, which awarded my parents the ability to come to either Aotearoa or Canada, and I think one more place, but I can't remember. And they chose Auckland partly because there was already a community. Now, I think the reason I kind of say this is because that's the position from which I want to become attentive to a place of being here and what it means to be in relation with Indigenous peoples. And within my own practice, what does that look like? So, for example, if we're thinking through Te Tiriti and if we're thinking through biculturalism, being attentive to how sometimes a rhetoric of multiculturalism can obfuscate and take over a relationship between people arriving and Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely.
Right? So
Yes.
that's very complex, tricky, and fertile territory, and it's ongoing as well. So, and I guess where I open it out is through personal relationships. It's not just a theoretical exercise, but through lived experience of having close friends who identify in various ways and who are thinking through this problem in their own personal biographies, through their work, and thinking alongside each other of who am I in relation with you.
Yeah, I think as well for myself in terms of what's quite key to my practice, whether it's in a teaching capacity or in art making or collaboration, curation, is that it is always collaborative and it's working in relationship with others, and it's often a very intense working relationship, or a relationship in which I get to know people, and it's also a relationship that will go over many years, as opposed to a short project where they come into relationship and then leave. So it was this idea of conversational research, of ongoing, and so it's, I suppose, finding or working relationship by relationship, as you go. I have had the privilege, when I did my Masters in Museums and Cultural Heritage, of doing research around Māori art exhibitions, a history of Māori art exhibitions. And that was really important for me because at art school we weren't taught any of that history. No really like New Zealand history either. So it was kind of, that was really important in terms of understanding my position within a discourse here around art. Because I have whakapapa, but I wouldn't say that I made contemporary Māori art. But then also trying to sort of seeing how an exhibiting practice has been embedded in a social, political, a larger movement project. And then I now have the context in which I can articulate my positionality, as opposed to, people would often say to me, oh, you make work about place and history and you have whakapapa, you make Māori art. I can now go, no, actually I don't think I do make Māori art. Yeah, in terms of my own positioning. So it's maybe one day I will, but right now I don't. Yeah. But the assumptions that come through.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of the past 1.5 years being in this space, and really the one thing that it has meant for my own embodied experience is thinking hard about what the question of solidarity looks like in practice, So I think about it in terms of academic practice. You think about it in terms of artistic practice, but all of these, at the end of the day, are intertwined deeply with the production of knowledge, which is intertwined with the kinds of material impacts in the world that we live in. So, let's take Ihumata for an example. What responsibilities do artists have when they are immersed in a context where there is a call for resisting sort of this neoliberal land grab, which sort of is the face of this sort of last stage of neoliberal capital, right? Where grab whatever is the leftover indigenous land so these can be commoditized and marketized. So what is the responsibility of artists, academics, to respond to these kinds of calls in the context that we live in?
I think a couple of things occur to me. One is to kind of be attuned to, within the core group of family members, some of them are artists, some of them have an exhibition making practice, some of them are photographers.
Yeah.
So there's already at its core, a artistic production that allows for resistance, that it's not disassociated from it.
Absolutely.
And another kind of thing that occurs to me is like some friends and artists have made a real wonderful contribution that we're learning from constantly about what it means to be in accompaniment and in solidarity. And here we're thinking of Rebecca Ann Hobbs. So it's to kind of observe and learn from how solidarity is working, where an artist is showing ways to stand alongside through their practice. So it's amazing, even within that example of Ihumata, that in the core group of family and in the wider circle of community, there are artists inflected everywhere.
And all around it,
Yes.
And at St. Paul Street also, this was before I joined the team, there were exhibitions that spoke to place, spoke to practice around solidarity and so on. But the second thing that occurs to me is that there's art for social change, but then there's also art and social change, in the sense that sometimes a mortgaging of art to the practice of social change blinds you perhaps to the radical potential for an art that is functioning at the space of impossibility. I guess what I mean by that is, like, when I've been most moved by art, it's because I have no idea what's going on. The most recent example that brought me so close to tears was when we were in Chicago. My wife Irina and I were traveling through the States. We were 5 days into Chicago, and we just couldn't understand why we felt so heavy. We were observing all around us, something that made our hair stand, something that was tense. We just couldn't reconcile this feeling that was there. As we do when we travel, we went to the museums there and we experienced a work by Arthur Jaffa. I think Love is the Message. That might be the title of the work. I think it's a bit longer than that. It's a 7-minute loop. And we were just stunned and watched that loop over and over and over again. Partly because there was no way to tell what exactly was going on in the work. The work is a montage clip of many sequences that celebrates Black American culture. So, for example, it has Obama singing gospel music in a church and then cuts directly to the jazz greats. But then it also cuts to showing the ways in which peoples are under the thumb and can't quite figure out ways out. So the police brutality and so on. It cuts so rapidly between those two things that you're left thinking, actually we're asking the same questions. We're asking the same questions in a different context. So what I mean to say by art for social change and art and social change is that in this instance, its effectiveness was not because there was a direct or even indirect thing that I could find for a material benefit of a people, but that it just floored me. It just completely moved me in such a way that it's kind of hard to language and hard to see how it is measurable. And that's kind of why I often speak about the immeasurability of art, the impossibility of it, the kind of constant groping for its meaning. And I guess that comes back to why it is that I sort of put myself in a position from the very first or second years of art school being interested in interpretative capacities like the hermeneutics rather than art making, right? So I guess there's ways in which art functions and artistic practice functions that sometimes encourage you to ask the right questions, and then other work can be possible.
Well, there's a sort of a starting of a conversation, so this conversational drift or a slow burn that sort of emanates out of that experience or that gallery that you reflect on or you're reminded of, and that you're constantly questioning or reinterpreting it. That slow burn is the power.
Yeah, and it's an invitation to imagine, where you're continually imagining.
Yes.
Right, and the interpretive frames themselves are fragmented, disjointed, never really complete. Yeah, you know, the one thing that I find so much resonance in the work of CARE, particularly the culture-centered approach and the way I listen to you, is the placing of listening, embodied listening at the heart of practice, and then a commitment to complicating the notion of voice. So if we were to listen to voices, particularly the voices that are erased and unheard, what does it mean to turn ourselves to the unheard? Because we don't know what that is. Because our senses have not been trained to feel, hear, see, that which is hidden, erased, untouchable in that sense. So I guess, as we move toward wrapping up, one of the things I would like to ask is that how do you center yourself on this commitment to listening, which seems like, to me, as someone coming into a relationship with both of you and looking at your beautiful relationship, it seems like that is continually emergent in your conversations,
Listening. I think part of it is like in terms of my own work is trying to not have a fixed outcome or predefined idea. So always trying to catch myself in that, what I'm projecting, and also being comfortable in a messiness, a complexity of going into an engagement without the expectation or even being willing to just let whatever needs to emerge will emerge. And that, I suppose, also reflecting or wanting to shift practice. We're both quite really interested in CCA because we have worked with others, been in relationship, made participatory structures, but they've always been top down. And so the question really for us is, or the challenge is in that listening, how are we going ground up instead of top down? How can we do that? That's the learning that we're on. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. That's why we're here.
Yeah.
We're here to learn.
I struggle with that, you know.
Yeah. And I guess it's like also seeing the ways in which we get seduced in terms of like the I think it was one of your phrases that just stuck with me, the curatable voice, you know, in terms of, you know, this tension that you might have, which is like, oh, that practice is not sexy enough,
Yeah.
or, you know, or that where will I go with this sort of a project? What kind of political power or personal sort of cultural capital is possible? You know, and just keeping oneself in check becomes its own practice. No, it's like constantly going, hey, you sure you're not wanting to do that just because?
Yeah.
And just constantly wanting to ask that of ourselves to see where it is that listening is coming from. That who are
where
you?
the motivation is, eh?
Yes.
So often you can think about that your like internal motivation is your you know, actually an extrinsic motivation. You constantly getting muddled between those two things.
You know, one of my favorite authors is Gayatri Spivak. And of course, you know, I think part of that is that a lot of what she writes about, I relate culturally and contextually to the same part of India. And then she has this ongoing project that she doesn't write about a whole lot, is the work of working with teachers in the grassroots that work in rural communities. And she reflects on that work by talking about how do we learn to learn from below. You know, and so in the context of the way that translates into some of the work in the culture-centered approach is that how do we, on one hand, work in solidarity on methods of democracy and democratic participation, you know, which is sort of the question of participation that you bring up, so that we, those of us that inhabit these hegemonic structures, develop the ethic of learning to learn from below, so that one day, someday in that imagined future, these infrastructures are owned by subaltern communities where they don't need interlocutors like us. So we write ourselves off in that sense from that discursive space, right? So I want to wrap up with this question then, that, you know, on one hand, artists struggle with precarity. And on the other hand, if you're challenging this professionalization of art, what would it mean for an artist to write himself or herself off so that subaltern artists, makers, can occupy their spaces and voices can be heard?
We've often been asking ourselves recently, what does it mean to do yourself out of a job? And then what does that mean in terms of what your role is, or how you articulate what your role is as well? So maybe to shift from artist to facilitator, or from curator to mediator, or and the way that you, I think, Balamohan, and you worked in How to Live Together, your most recent exhibition, is that you did yourself out of a job by introducing Kiani and Aki. They have a conversation. You don't have to be part of that conversation. It goes beyond you. You've played your role. As opposed to micromanaging that situation, right?
Yes.
Is also, I suppose we've been having discussions around that complexity around authorship as well. And often the conversation that I've had with, you know, even my family members who aren't artists or haven't gone to art school is often the thing is, I can't draw, I'm not an artist, or like I never went to art school, I don't know anything about art. So that professionalization has also meant that the audience becomes there's a barrier between them and the engagement. So we've also been asking in terms of curation, are we just talking to ourselves? How do we open up? How do we open up a space, or shift that relationship? And what would it mean then to shift categories or roles, or to shift authorship? Would that create a space in which other voices can be heard, or that they can take that role?
I just recently wrote a piece where I was thinking through this idea of commitment and what does it mean to commit. And when I see you working in that, I see the embodiment of that struggle of commitment and what that question really means. So that's very humbling for me to be in this dialogue with you. So thank you. As we wrap up, I wanted to ask if there is anything that you wanted to share or you wanted to bring up to share with our community that is spread across the globe and often connecting through various forms of media.
I guess it feels to us, it feels to me like the beginning of learning this field of work, I guess, around culture-centered approach, because there's a lot that we can learn, I think, that has to do with what it means to be in situations where you're constantly asking yourself who you are in relation with other people. Because at times it might be too comfortable waiting to be called into a situation, but there's a scope within the work that care does, and what I feel like I'm observing within the ongoing works is that within doing yourself out of a job that Taarati had mentioned, it's like, what is the imaginaries that we're working towards, and how does art inflict upon the background image you hold in your mind as you work towards those imaginaries? So those are the kinds of things that we're sitting with and kind of working through.
A bigger project.
Yeah.
Lifelong project.
Yeah, and trying to, I guess, see, like, in some way, there's a call for a practice to constantly define itself, like a curatorial practice that constantly wants to challenge its own terms. Like we talked about the terms of representation. Yes. We can also look at the sort of the political economies that wants us to select certain artists and not others, and the institutions within which we work and find inflections that we open out. So it's like this, within this constant questioning, we're quite inspired by how the questions feel so sympathetic between care and between what we'd like to learn in terms of defining. I mean, we are at the stage of an apprenticeship, really. Like, we're at the stage where we're being attentive and wanting to define our own practices in relation with other people. We're still quite early in that journey. So that's what feels exciting for us, putting our practices into a bigger context.
And I feel like I too am in a stage of apprenticeship, where and I mean it in full sincerity, that the question of learning, listening, these seem to be so powerful also in terms of the ways in which particular ideologies that we inhabit that make us aware of certain things and not others. So, only the other day, while conversing with a colleague, and they were saying that, the notion of voice in the CCA doesn't attend to those that cannot speak, or those that cannot hear. I'm thinking about it within the context of physical and material disabilities, and how do we think of metaphors in new ways. So I think it's an ongoing journey for us. I think in terms of thinking through what it means for these infrastructures to be built, where there is sort of almost like, as you're saying, an open-ended democracy, but an open-ended democracy that is also grounded in cognitive justice. For those that have been erased systematically, being told that you don't produce knowledge, you don't produce art, So thank you so much. Looking forward to the ongoing conversations with you, and to really, hopefully, nurturing a long-term journey of learning together.
Absolutely.
Yes.
It'd be a huge privilege. That's wonderful. We look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Taarati and Balamohan, pleasure to have you here. Thank you for hanging out with us in this conversation. This is really a new space in terms of the thinking of the culture-centered approach. Would love to hear your thoughts. Please do share them through Facebook chats, and we would respond to you to those. And once again, welcome to a week of conversations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.